Hi everyone and welcome to Innovating for Good. This is a monthly series brought to you by UNHCR Innovation and SocialGood. More than a buzzword, innovation's become a necessity in the humanitarian sector. It's more than new technology. Innovation in the humanitarian sector is about being adaptive so that we can efficiently face new challenges. It's also about finding new, creative and sustainable ways to solve our biggest problems. Innovating for Good wants to have a dialogue about how innovation can impact humanitarian work. Last month, we looked at how SMS technology is being used in humanitarian crises. Now today, we'll be talking about alternative designs for temporary shelter. So with us today are Johan Carlson from Better Shelter and Tom Corsellis from the Shelter Center based in Geneva. I wanted to introduce the two of our guests who we're very lucky to be hosting today. Johan, maybe I can ask you to introduce yourself to the audience and give us a bit of an overview of who you are, what you're working on, and what you have been working on over the past couple of years.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. I'm Johan Carlson. I'm currently the head of business development at Better Shelter, and that means that I'm responsible for our offerings in the products development, but also service development. What we are doing temporary shelters, which are fly-in solutions for emergency and temporary shelter needs in the humanitarian sector. So I'm working responsible for the product development and also the service development. But before I took on this role, I worked with this organization for the last now 5 years in developing a new shelter solutions, which is what we call the Better Shelter Unit today. It has been in the media, we refer to as the IKEA shelter or the IKEA UNHCR flat pack shelter. It had many names. I've been the project manager from this. We started out as an R&D team, working very much hands-on with product design and developing a prototype which we have tested. And then the last year, I have my responsibility has to bring this from an R&D product and to transform it into a business and set up the supply chain and production and everything to what is required for us in the position we are today, where we are soon about to start delivering shelters to UNHCR for field operation.
Thanks very much, Johan. And then I also wanted to introduce you to Tom Corsellis from the Shelter Center. Tom, if I could ask the same of you to give us a bit of an overview of what you're working on now, what you've been working on over the past couple of years.
Hello everyone, yes. Shelter Center supports the global humanitarian community of practice looking at shelter and settlement. We do that with global meetings, regularly a global knowledge management system, an online library. You can have a look at Humanitarian Library online. But also we look to identify common sector projects of interest to people implementing on the ground. And one of those started way back in 2006 was looking at this transitional tent approach after we introduced a transitional shelter approach earlier during operations with UNHCR in Sri Lanka back in 2005. This transitional tent project involved first us agreeing as a humanitarian community standards for the shape and size of the shelter and so forth, and then asking a series of manufacturers to come and produce prototypes against those standards, and also to inform the further development of those standards. That's where I first met Johan, and Johan came in to that group, one of the 8 manufacturers who came in on that. He has since taken the progress that we made some years ago and moved them on considerably, really taking on not only the ethos of the proposal and the design, but also engaging in manufacturing processes so that the ideas generated, the general consensus agreed, could be taken forward to its next steps. And that's the challenge always in creating innovative solutions, is actually carrying the idea through to the end. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks very much, Johan, and welcome to this month's discussion. So I wanted to, if I may, run through a couple questions with the two of you, noting your different experiences within the shelter realm, within the humanitarian sphere. And Tom, I wanted to start with you. You've already touched upon some of the points that I think that we're going to be discussing today. But to help us put this topic into context, can you tell us what some of the biggest shelter challenges are for organisations such as UNHCR, such as some of our implementing partners, such as Care International, and so on and so forth?
Sure. The first thing to think about in shelter, of course, is that the vast majority of shelters will be locally built with local materials, and they should be built like that. You're building with the technology that people understand, using materials that people know how to build with, and they know how to maintain. However, there are very specific circumstances, given the urgency of need, given environmental fragility, and given also the need for people to move around, where these sorts of shelters, transitional tents in this case, are an important contribution. So some of the challenges people are facing in shelters is that when they're displaced, when they become refugees and persons of concern to the UNHCR, is that they're having to move from location to location, that they're having to move very quickly, but also they might have to stay in that location for a number of years. And in doing so, the usual emergency shelter solutions, the tentage, won't last long enough to be able to cover them over the duration of their displacement and support their return back to durable solutions when they get back to their home countries. And so the major challenge for us is not building a house, which I think all UNHCR shelter people would have no challenges to do, but to be able to create an environment where the needs of those affected can be supported rather than us leading their shelter solutions. It is their decisions and their solutions that we seek to support, and the hope is that these transitional tents are going to offer another tool in the toolbox to help us do that with them.
Sure. Okay. Thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Tom. I think you've touched upon some really interesting points there, and I wanted to. We actually had a question from Twitter. So Johan, before I ask you the next question, we had a question from Ross Kincaid, who tweeted to us, and I think this is a good question for you, Tom. Do you think self-built shelters with design guidance are a viable option at times?
I mean, in experience, they're the default response. Very definitely, yes. And it is something, an approach, which is used consistently in much of UNHCR's programming, but also in much of the programming of other agencies. The idea is that you might do something called a phased materials drop, where you come around with materials, you drop off some materials, and you come in and give technical advice. And you continue that process until the shelter is built safely and correctly. So yes, self-built shelters with design guidance, an excellent general approach. There are circumstances where that is not possible, and that is where these forms of shelter, such as the one being produced by Johan, are relevant.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tom. I think that was a clear answer to Ross Kincaid, who had a question from Twitter. Johan, I wondered if we can segue from the kind of the big picture that Tom's given us, and fleshed out, actually, thanks to Ross's question. Maybe we can drill down a little bit. So we're moving from the big picture. I wanted to ask you, with specific regard to the previously named refugee housing unit, the now newly named Better Shelter, how do you account for all of the complexities, such as those mentioned by Tom, in your design process? So I wondered if you could take us through the design process, the first steps, initial sketches designed, all the way through to the first prototype. And after that, we're gonna move on to the utility and the value of human-centered design. So over to you, Johan.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think the biggest challenge when starting an innovation project is to find a focus of what are we going to do to address the questions rightly. Because I think it's very easy when you start a product like we did, looking at the tents that were used today, and they're fairly similar to the one that Alexander the Great used when he invaded Persia now for some 2,000 years ago. And when you're saying something like that, which we did, we were not very into humanitarian response when we started it. then you create expectations, and I often think it's easy to create expectation of that we are creating a silver bullet solution which will work everywhere, which is not the case. And that is, I think, something that you really need to realize as a designer, and you also need to manage those expectations towards various stakeholders who are, in this case, the IKEA Foundation, who are our sponsors, you know, to our partners in UNHCR, and also to the private sector. That we are not creating a silver bullet solution, but we actually have to address one problem. And what we nailed it down to was that we're going to develop a fly-in solution in areas where it's needed, and that was usually where we had you know, remote locations with very little localist materials when logistics was very complex. Or when you have a big scale of influx of refugees, we need to bring in a solution, you know, to deploy it, to set it up on time. We're not going to do something which are replacing, you know, local-made solutions, because all research is against that. All experience that we have discussed with humanitarian agencies is against that. However, that does not mean that this product is not, you know, needed. It has a very pure and good function. I think that was the first thing, and then there was also, of course, this long wish list of requirements. You know, it should not cost more than a tent a day. It should last for 3 years, whereas the tent lasts for roughly 1 year. You know, it shouldn't weight more than a tent. And what we saw, that all the requirements, they were basically the same requirements as we had on the tent. And if you don't change these requirements, then you're going to come up with the same solution, which would be a tent. And I think that's what we, you know, we worked really hard the first year to find new materials, new production technologies, which could bring us away from this. But then we realized that if we're going to stick to these requirements we are having, we're going to come up with the same solution. So again, you know, the design brief is crucial, and to question that one. And that's, I think, where we had the first breakthrough with UNHCR, where we said, okay, we're not going to be able to do this. We have a very impossible equation here of upfront costs, the durability of the shelter, and also the weight and the volume, you know, requirements. If we can change one of these parameters, we can do something different, or two. But if we're going to keep them exactly like we have with a tent, you know, it's going to cost something like, I think our first target was $500 with 50 kilos, and be something like 0.2 cubic meters. Then we're going to come up with the same solution. That's when we agree to that. Okay, that's actually would make sense for us to make something with a higher upfront cost, which could last longer, and which also would be, you know, compatible with sphere standards, something that you could, you know, walk upright in, have, you know, sufficient height of the shelter, sufficient floor size, etc. So when we realized that, and that gave us some more room to innovate, and yeah. And from there, I think that then it was more like the hands-on development work, the design work, and that's not much different from any other design work. Actually, you know, you prototype, you test, you fail, and then you try again, and then you improve from there. And I think that's how the process has been. Yeah?
Excellent. Thanks very much, Johan. So I think so you basically revisited the expectations of the various stakeholders. You went back and wanted to really force the difficult questions around the requirements that UNHCR perhaps were looking at. And I think this helped to frame the project, drilling down from some of the big questions that Tom was talking about, drilling down to the resetting expectations and re-questioning what the needs are. I think a really important part of the process that we went through together with the refugee housing unit, now the Better Shelter unit, was the involvement of the end user. So I wondered whether you could speak to that point. How did we engage end users, and not just the kind of perceived needs of humanitarian agencies such as UNHCR?
Yeah. Well, what we did was, I think we had a two-stage user involvement. I think first, when we started the project in the first place, we did do user research of refugees who were not in camps, who actually were in Sweden, and who had lived in Dadaab camp. We had a Somali community here. That was actually very informative, because that gave us sort of the soft non-technical values in what the problem was with the shelters and the tents that they had been living in. But then, of course, it has been crucial that we have worked in the field and had these shelters built by refugees. We have revisited them several times, and that had fed into us a lot of insights that we would else not have had, and which have actually informed the design of the shelter, which has made quite a transition from the model that we field tested in Dolorado and Iraq now some 2 years ago to the model we're having right now.
Okay, thanks very much, Johan. So I wanted to ask one more question of you, and then I'm gonna move back to Tom, if I may. So the last question that I wanted to ask for the time being. So there are several temporary shelter designs out there. In fact, more than several. I think we did a lot of research together. You guys probably did a lot more research than I did, but there are many temporary shelters designs out there. What's different about the better shelter unit?
Well, I think it's possible to compare it to all of the other solutions because again they're all different. What I think is a key feature that we are having is the lifespan, and the size of the shelter with a reasonable, upfront cost, which is today $11.50 US. That's what we have resolved. Then there are so many alternatives out there. What we could see that, because in many aspects, humanitarian shelter has been a playground for architects and designers, and I think in most architecture schools around the world, you have like a 5-week course on sort of tensile structures or humanitarian shelters. Because it contains a lot of architectural elements and challenges to do that. I think what a lot of designs that we have seen have focused on, they have been perceived that we need Formula One solutions, like really rapid deployment, sort of airdrop shelters. That has been the conflict that we have seen from innovators and engineers. Whereas something that we found was more needed was like something more durable, maybe perhaps a bit less sexy, and not something that sort of self-inflates and is just there, but that actually is durable over the long haul and at a very reasonable price. We usually compare it that a lot of people think that what humanitarian sector need is Formula Ones, but we think it's like more like an old Volkswagen or Ford where it's needed. And I think that's what we have tried to create.
Okay, thanks very much, Johan. Tom, before we move on to a question for you, actually this is a question from you from Sam Perkins from Twitter. So Sam's question, and I direct this one to Tom. Can transitional shelters distributed by UNHCR, and I'm gonna slightly amend this question. Can transitional shelters distributed by UNHCR and implementing partners and operating partners within the shelter the shelter sphere be adapted to suit local conditions and, crucially, local needs by persons of concern over time? So I think this is a question about transitioning and adding your own modifications to shelters. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you. I mean, the point builds very well on from the point made by Mr. Kincaid earlier, looking at self-built shelters. Let's look at 4 different types of shelter at the moment. Let's look at a permanent reconstruction, which is, it could be an apartment building. When I was coordinating shelter for HCR back in the Balkans, that's what we were doing. But then let's move through to something that requires building on site, and it requires building durably. Yeah? The second type of shelter, let's take that as a standard transitional shelter as conceived, and that is, again, local build, as Mr. Kincaid was talking about earlier, using local materials, but it is something that transitions. The idea is that the materials that you give out to people are still used later on throughout the response. Now, the difference between those first 2 different types are, in the first one, people haven't been displaced from their homes. In the second one, people have been displaced, they've been moved away, and because of that, and because of the duration of their displacement, we're going to have to find shelter with them that will help them be sheltered over the duration of their displacement. The third type of shelter would be Johan's transitional tent, yeah? And that's That's not local build from local materials. That's an imported solution because maybe there aren't the local materials. Maybe we need that speed of response. Maybe there's an environmental concern. The last type of shelter, the fourth type, might be a standard tent or a piece of plastic sheeting, a tarpaulin and some ropes. That again is very good for very early on, the immediate emergency phase. But the danger of that fourth type is that how are those materials going to be used over the longer term? How are they going to be an investment in durable solution? So what Johan's done with this transitional tent is he's created a very simple shed shape. Yeah? And that shed shape, you can put tin sheet, corrugated CGI roofing on the top. You could put mud walls up the side, or you could put mats, woven mats along the side. So there are lots of ways that this shelter can be upgraded over time. What Johan will have done, he will have bought time for those refugees, for those people of concern, to be able to, over time, upgrade and assist in their own sheltering process with what is available to hand on the ground. Johan's given them the head start, he's given them a bit of space to be able to regroup and upgrade their shelters. So briefly, yes, you can upgrade transitional shelters and transitional tents. And that's the hope, is to bring in something initially which answers immediately their shelter needs that night. They have to sleep somewhere that night. Yeah? And then after that, enables them to upgrade over the duration of displacement and repair those shelters.
Thanks very much, Tom. That's a great answer to Sam Perkins. Okay, so I wanted to ask another question of you, Tom, and I think you've touched upon this when you talked us through the four different types of shelter just now. But what are some of the other things you have to consider when selecting a shelter solution? And I'm gonna frame this question for an emergency response.
Initially, there's what is there around on the ground. Are you talking, Chris? Are you talking about selecting imported airliftable shelters, or are you talking about shelter in general in emergency context?
I was actually talking about shelter in general, but in this respect, I think let's narrow the question down to imported shelters in particular.
Right. So the only reason why you'd use an imported shelter is because the materials aren't there available to be able to do local shelter, or you need to move extraordinarily quickly because there are threats to people's lives through lack of shelter. When you're selecting a shelter for that, you have a series of criteria. The first is whether or not is weight, and volume, and that's all about airlifting. Airlifting only really works if you've got a sub-100 kilo balanced volume shelter. Yeah? So that's one area. So we've got logistics concerns, we've got social concerns, we've got cost concerns. Let's take these three areas. So logistics, I've already talked about a little bit. We've got airlift, we've got volume, we've got speed of delivery, speed of deployment. There are a whole series of, have the shelter producers, have they got enough of them to be able to deliver them? Are we going to have to put different shelters next to each other from different manufacturers, which may create tensions? So that's the first logistics component of this. Now let's take the social component. The central component is what is acceptable to the people concerned, and what are the climatic conditions that they're used to, what are their traditions of living, and so forth. There are some commonalities that can be arrived at, and we, in the development of those standards, which Johan then built way beyond our initial progress, those initial standards were looking at social components and looking at livability, looking at, do you want, for example, in a Muslim society to have a haramlik and a saremlik, a division between men and women within the shelter? Do you have cold climate use problems in people coming in and out of the shelter an awful lot? Yeah? And then also you've got the technical, more technical and procurement and financial concerns, and obviously there is a cost. There's not only a cost of the shelter, there's also a cost of deploying it. So you could have a very cheap shelter, but if you need to replace it frequently, the cost of that replacement, the cost of airlifting it in, the cost of staff costs to be able to work that through, outweigh the cheaper cost of the tent. And so it's a balancing act to try to create a transitional tent that lasts long enough to be able to span the duration of displacement, but at the same time can be upgraded to maximize its longevity. There are also criteria, for example, about are they going to need to move? Yeah, and obviously UNHCR is continually seeking durable solutions with the refugees and persons of concern. So it's trying to help these people get back home again. And under certain circumstances, it may be valuable to have their shelter that can move back home with them. And that's where those weight criteria that we discussed with airlift become important. You need to be able to pack the thing up again and take it home and build it up, because maybe your home, remember that first category that we talked about earlier in terms of the 4 categories of shelter? Maybe when you go home, your apartment building, your house will have been damaged to beyond your use. So you'll need somewhere to live while that building is rebuilt by yourselves or by the international aid community. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That's a really good overview of the considerations that you might take into account when deploying shelters from outside, i.e., not locally available shelters. We spoke about logistics. We spoke about upfront costs of investment. We spoke about the cost of deployment itself, and really crucially, I think you started to flesh out the social considerations, and not just from the shelter expert who may be on the ground making those decisions, but also the acceptance of refugees, of people of concern. And I think that's something that I think we could probably all agree is sometimes needs a little bit more work. But listen, I wanted to move on. Johan, can you talk to us a little bit about acceptable risk, how you make decisions around what is an acceptable risk when you enter an R&D process of, for example, the Better Shelter unit?
I think the risk there are different kinds of risk. I think we have the foremost is the risk towards the end user in terms of safety of a product. I think that is the most important. What would happen if our product would fail? Of course, people would lose their home, but could they also get hurt, or even worse in terms of fire spreads? Because we do know a lot of people do cook inside these shelters, even though they're not meant for that. So if there was a fire hazard, can people escape on time? So the safety requirements for the end user, they are important, and then we also need to, and then it's also the financial risk that we need to look. How certain are we? And that's more like addressing where the shelter that we have or any other solution, where it works well, what it means the environmental requirements. We have a certain lifespan. We know we have a known performance in many technical aspects of the shelter. But every place around the world is unique. You have different wind loads, different sun radiation, etc. So you need to assess that risk to say, okay, is our shelter suitable in this region? Because it's the upfront cost, will it pay off over time to use this shelter? And acceptable risk to set that, and I think it's important to have a benchmark of risk of what is the current option that we are having today. What are we comparing this to? We're comparing it to a tent or transitional shelter. Then we need to find a risk level which is at least on par with this, preferably better off. But we may not be able, even though that was our intention, to fully, implement like a European building code or a standard onto the shelter itself. I think that is the minimum requirement. And then again, before testing, also before usage testing, when piloting these things, then it's also important to remember that these are people who haven't chosen to always live in this shelter. They haven't chosen to become refugees. They are forced to do it. So it makes it very different to design a refugee shelter than to make, for example, a new vacuum, cleaner. And then you have a focus group and they use your vacuum cleaner, for 2 months, and you ask them, how was it? Here we need to pay much more attention to safety, factors before conducting a pilot. And that's also why it took us quite a long time before we could get the shelter out in the field, because we needed to test as much as we could of all the technical performance of the shelter to know that it's safe. And then for the pilot study, so to verify that we had set the right requirements in the first place, because a technical failure could be even that it wasn't produced according to our specifications, or there was a problem with our specifications. But foremost, it was to get a user impact to the shelter. How is it living inside this? How is the privacy? What would you like to improve, etc.
Thanks, Johan. And I seem to remember when we were both in Dolorado in southeast Ethiopia when we were planning the user testing of the first refugee housing unit shelters in the field together with our friends and colleagues from the shelter and settlement section of UNHCR. We did a lot of work just speaking to people about. Did they want to try this new approach with us? What were their concerns? Did they not want to try this new approach with us? And we spent a lot of time with the communities before we even brought any RHUs down to Dolorado. And I remember we had some great conversations with Hassan and some of the other guys down there when we were just showing pictures, and we were kind of explaining, what does the solar part mean? What are the panels made of? What are the possibilities for return and repatriation? We had a great build up to introducing the actual shelters themselves. Yeah. So listen, I wanted to ask Tom, and I think you've touched upon this. You've touched upon this already, but I wanted to really understand. When we look at context, and earlier we were talking about the emergency context, but how do you create a shelter design that's adaptable to a range of contexts? Are we just talking about weather? Are we just talking about culture? What are some of the considerations that you think that we need to consider?
Yes, Johan has an impossible job. He has to create one shelter which will fit every circumstance in often the most extreme environments in the world, supporting people who have very, very different needs. And there are also different operational concerns there, as I said, about return and so forth. That's an equation where every component part is a variable. It's an impossible job unless you start looking at it systematically, as Johan has done, which means to start, rather than creating an average that meets none of those criteria, to create an enabling tool, something that can be genuinely adapted to different contexts. Now, let's take those points one by one. Let's take the social first. Very different lifestyles, but also people of different age. You've got gender concerns going there as well, with people wanting to live in different ways, and protection against gender-based violence. You've got a number of other components about family size, about how communities work together, about unaccompanied people in that society as well. All you can do to start with that is to create a shelter, and then also have that adaptability component on top to be able to allow for that local modification. I'm sure Johan will admit that any average shelter, any shelter created on an average for a global use, all that we know about it is that when it arrives, it isn't quite yet fit for purpose. It must be adapted to local circumstances. He cannot create a shelter that is universal. It is physically impossible to do so. What he can do is create the process and the enabling tool, the device, his shelter, which will allow all of the rest to actually happen. Then you get on to the climatic concerns. I've been asked to winterize camps designed for the summer and summerize camps developed for the winter. You often end up with extreme climatic ranges. Let's take Pakistan or Iraq. It gets very cold and very hot. Deserts get cold in the winter, at night especially, and you've got huge problems with conductive heat loss through the ground. If someone lies on the ground and goes to sleep, they are at risk of their lives because of the conducted heat lost through their body and through the ground. And so we need to create an environment where the internal space can be, again, adapted to different circumstances. The logistic stuff I think we have touched upon, the need sometimes for the shelter to be relocated, but that is, having a relocatable shelter then enables us to avoid the circumstance of investing in a permanent shelter in an area where permanent occupation cannot happen. There's no point building permanent houses in a refugee camp. It may also be politically very difficult to do so. And therefore, this approach enables, in the specific circumstances we talked, and I come back to Mr. Kincaid's point right at the beginning, the majority of shelters are locally built, but in those circumstances where we need what Johan's developed, it's very good that we can then adapt the result.
Thanks very much, Tom. That was a great answer to quite a complicated question. So this is the next question is, I'm going to start with I'm going to put it to Johan, and then I'm going to ask Tom for your inputs as well before we wrap up this session. This is a question that is very topical because in UNHCR Innovation, at least, we're seeing a lot of our projects getting to the point where they will be or should be or need to be scaled, or at least handed over to another part of UNHCR. They will have passed the prototyping point. They will have a lot of evidence to suggest that they should be scaled or could be scaled. But one thing that I think we see a lot of in the humanitarian sector is this kind of notion of pilotitis. It seems to be quite a big challenge in the sector, not limited to UNHCR, definitely not limited to shelter, but you know, we invest money in an R&D process. We invest money testing some of these solutions or some of these systems in a variety of different environments, operating environment. So Johan, what do you see? I mean, you've been working with UNHCR for the past couple of years. Your solution, your shelter solution that you've developed along with us is really starting to scale. But what are some of the biggest challenges that you see as somebody who works with us but doesn't work directly for us, UNHCR? What do you see as being some of the biggest challenge in moving from prototype through to production?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, I think, starts actually before the prototype itself. It starts when getting an agreement or consensus about what do we want to create. I think it's very hard for any UN agency to say, or because it's not like in a company where you have someone who is head of product development and says, okay, this is what we want. No, let's go for it. This is, we have many stakeholders in the organization. There is Geneva, and then there is the field, and so the organization, it is much bigger. It's more complex and the more people involved, I would say, in UNHCR than it would have been if we would have done this project for a company like IKEA, for example, because then this would be at some mid-level manager's desk looking at the financial size of this project. And he would have all the mandate and right to make a decision. So decision making is different. And then I think that then there's also a challenge with incentives for innovation. I think within UNHCR and the humanitarian world, and I think even at Shelter Center, I mean, with Tom, we have had these discussions many times. There is a challenge with open innovation. I think in the humanitarian world, there is an idea that innovations should be open source because this worked for the for the web. It works for a lot of software. And it is a very nice idea that we make something which everybody can share. However, when it comes to hardware, it is different because there are quite significant investments that need to be made in R&D and in producing prototypes, which are fairly expensive, and also conducting the trials. And as any businessmen to have an incentive to invest in this is that they will know that it will have a return on their investment in case the solution would be successful. So would any company make a solution which would be approved and agree this is good? Then at least I think the companies would like to know that, hey, we are going to get the rights to deliver. Whereas with the UNHCR and many other organizations we have discussed with, okay, let's develop this together. When we have reached to a solution, then let's open source it and go for public procurement. And by doing that, we take out incentives from many private sector investors. Unfortunately, we have had IKEA Foundation, which is the philanthropic arm of IKEA, and not to be mixed up with IKEA Furniture Company. who have supported us a lot. But we have had these challenges, and we have had these challenges with our suppliers. Even when we have been paying for their development, they had said that we're not sure we want to do this development if we're going to open source it, because we are living from this. We are producing, for example, panel manufacturers. We are it's our everyday income is from producing this kind of plastics, and we happen to be the world leader in this. We're the only one who know to do this. We're not sure, even if you pay us, that we want to do R&D if you're going to put it up open source. So I think that idea is also creates sort of conflicts in the innovation process.
Thanks very much, Johan. So Tom, I'm gonna ask you the same question, and I note that your engagement within the humanitarian shelter sphere exceeds probably mine and Johan's experience in the professional world combined. But I also wanted to kind of really provide a bit more context to Shelter Centre and the role that it plays in pulling together the humanitarian shelter community. It has a unique position in the shelter community. So with that context, I ask you the same question. What do you see as being some of the biggest challenges in moving from prototype to production?
The simple answer and the quick answer is consensus within various groups. Over the length of my involvement in this sector, it has been obvious that the series of shelters that have been developed, I've seen 4 or 5 shelters be developed within UNHCR alone. The opportunity is that if we can all get together on the humanitarian side and agree what colour and shape, and then we can communicate that clearly to the manufacturers so that Johan can see where he should make his investments. What happened in this circumstance, of course, is Johan, in forming a relationship with UNHCR, was able to say, well, we've taken that process, which is that consensus process, that's been done. Now what we need to do is to take it on to its next step and start producing these things. Consensus is going to come back again as being important later on, because not only will Johan want to sell his shelters to other agencies, therefore he needs to make sure that those other agencies want to buy his shelter, and that's why having consensus standards at the beginning is a very good idea. But also, we don't only want one manufacturer producing tents, and Johan alluded to that as well, in that they're rapidly prototyping a highly intricate, sophisticated system, which is actually becoming simpler. Now, that's the whole point of this R&D phase, is to get the product functionally simpler, yeah? As well as resolving a whole bunch of things which is encountered with you in Doloado and elsewhere. But then once that's happened, and we need to then interest other manufacturers in being involved in creating alternatives, in engaging in competition, and being able to answer the same standards, the same problems in new, innovative, different ways. This is not a process which is going to end with a perfect shelter. It's a process which will and should continue forever. And people like Johan and the capacity that he brings to bear must be an incremental improvement. We can't keep redesigning the same shelter again. We've got to make it better and better and better each time. And the last word is, to make that happen, we need to record what's gone on. We need to make that information, the science behind it, the technology behind it, open source in terms of heat conduction through the floor and so forth. So if you look on humanitarianlibrary.org, where we have a channel, it's called, rather like on YouTube, a channel on transitional tents, you'll be able to see all of the research that went into that over the last dozen years, where we've looked at various aspects of structures and heat conduction, the social components you were talking about before, and those standards. And that foundation enables Johan to make the next able to come back to something which is broadly agreed, which other agencies can purchase, increasing the volume of sales, which allows Johan to create greater investments in improving his product, yeah? And then finally end up with a variety of solutions to the same problem, so that we can keep this innovation generated by competition, which is necessary if we're going to improve these products without continual central investment.
Thank you to both of you. I think the two different perspectives really converged around the notion of consensus. I couldn't agree more. Before we wrap up this session, we've got another question. Actually, we've got two questions from Rowena Chiang. I'm going to go for the second question. She says that significant investment needs to be made to hardware innovation. Why can't we make it open source? Johan, maybe you can tell us about future plans around shelter designs and the open source nature of them that Tom's also commented on.
The challenge with open source is that somewhere down the line, an investor or an organization is going to need to make a decision, put some money on the table to invest in a new production line, and they will not do that until they know that they have a right to deliver their product. They will not invest in R&D if they know that they don't have a right to deliver, because then what you encourage is for people to sit back and wait, what will come, and then they will not set up production lines for hypothetical orders or for open sourcing their knowledge, because then they would invite competition. So really, that's to make investors have a return on the investment in R&D. That's where we need to protect, have the intellectual property protected. However, we are a social company, and I think we have found a very good way here together with UNHCR, where we had said that yes, we're going to have our specifications open sourced after 2 years of delivery to UNHCR. We're going to open source it because that time it should give us a decent chance to get our investments recapped. And then we're going to open source it after 2 years to invite competitions. And if we cannot be competitive after these 2 years, of learning and trial to producing this and setting this up, if we are not competitive, then honestly we don't have the right to produce this shelter anymore. And second, I think that one to open source to have this short, short contracts in terms of exclusivity on intellectual property rights, together with an open book principle. That is very key. I mean, we are very transparent with UNHCR on our costings. Any surplus that we make, we reinvest in R&D for the humanitarian shelters. I think if we would have been a standard private company, we would have surely been able to distribute around 7% of our profits to our distributors. We don't do that. I think that is fair. But it should not be more than that. We should not misuse our position. So I think like a short-term exclusivity in terms of intellectual property rights, together with an open book policy where you put a cap on profit distributions, I think this is a mix that will do the trick, that will make this innovation work. Of course, this is the first time that we are doing it. We don't know about many other projects who have done this before, but we are very optimistic because now we see that we can balance the financial risk that have been invested in the project with the need of an open source solution to create the best end price possible in the future.
Thanks, Johan. That's a really comprehensive reply. So we've had some really great questions from people following the conversation also on Twitter. So I wanted to say a few thank yous before we wrap up today's session. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to Ross, to Sam, and to Rowena for giving us some tough questions. We like them; they're good. And we have some, and we've seen the depth of response that we were lucky enough to have from Johan and also from Tom. So secondly, I wanted to say a big thank you to Johan and Tom for joining us today, for giving your thoughts and letting us tap into your core competencies, for letting us tap into your experience. It's a really interesting and very important conversation to be having, and this really is just a representation of the tip of the iceberg. You both work you know, boots on the ground, working out the nitty-gritty of shelter response to provide the best shelter possible for refugees and other people of concern. Thirdly, I wanted to say a big thank you to Plus Social Good. We're launching, we have launched this monthly online Hangout series. It's a collaboration between UNHCR Innovation and Plus Social Good. Today's session looked at alternative shelter design for humanitarian crises. Our first session looked at SMS technologies. We're going to be having another live event in 1 month's time. So I wanted to ask today's audience, anybody who's listening into today's session and anyone who's following on Twitter, we'd love for you to be able to tweet suggestions to at UNHCR Innovation and Plus Social Good, suggestions for next month's topic. This is a really exciting series to be kind of co-sponsoring together with Plus Social Good. We're really excited about it, and we're excited to have the next month's conversation. So with that said, I wanted to say again big thank you to everyone for today's discussion. My name's Chris Ernie. I'm the co-lead of UNHCR Innovation. Thank you very much.